The most common form, by far, it is absolutely, whenever people think of a 1099, especially let's say the average individual, the average layperson, they may not even know there are all these other 1099s. Whenever somebody says 1099, most often this is the one they're thinking of. It's the 1099 miscellaneous. For most organizations, or like I said, individuals, that may be the only one they ever see. For most businesses, it's probably the only one they'll ever prepare and file. After reporting the basic demographics of the taxpayer, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit of how a lot of these forms are structured. Basically, all of our 1099 forms, once you get the basic layout of demographics and ID and stuff, you'll find out that that repeats throughout all the rest of the forms. So we're going to spend just a little bit of quick time here. So the basic demographics, if you see, there's a big box that'll say, what is the payer's name? What is the recipient's name? The payer is the person that's creating it, in this case, and sometimes some of the forms, they may subtly change the wording, but the idea is it's the person who's doing the reporting is the payer, so your business that's going to create this 1099, and that has to be, their name, their street address, their, legal address, but you have to kind of watch the format of that. If there's too many strange punctuation, it may make that difficult to have that form read electronically. You'll see this is the red line form. It's a computer scanned form at the IRS side. The payer's tax identification number is the one who's submitting it, and the recipient's tax identification number is who is the person who's receiving this. So it's important to make sure it can be the silliest error and the simplest of error, but make sure that ID is in the correct format and put in there correctly and not reversed. The recipient's name, and this can sometimes trip up sometimes some businesses that are reporting it. The recipient's name, if it is let's say a business or an LLC or whatever, it should have that business name in there. If it is a individual doing business as a business name, if that's a social in the recipient box, it should have the individual's name here. So it has to match, basically. The name of the recipient needs to match that ID. So that's one of the checks that you can do. And this is going to be the same across all different 1099s. That's why I'm spending just a little bit of time mentioning that. So once we get the basic demographics down for all forms also have a void and a corrected box. We actually talk a little bit about that as we talk about how to make corrections in these forms, and we cover that in part 3. But all this is pretty much, let's say, carbon copied in a way throughout all of the rest of the 1099. So make sure your ID matches the name, that you have the right formatting in here. Then that's going to make a lot of the biggest struggle for most 1099 errors a thing of the past for you. So after we report the basic demographics, you'll notice there's something called a Fatca, filing requirement checkbox. This is used if you're a U.S. payer reporting on a 1099 miscellaneous as part of satisfying your requirement to report with respect to a U.S. account for Chapter 4 purposes. So maybe this isn't you. I'm going to cover all these different little boxes so you just know what they're for. You also may notice there's a second 10 not box. Kind of a weird wording, right? This is used when you've been notified by the IRS 2 times within 3 calendar years that the payee provided an incorrect tax identification number. They're doing this matching. It's basically going to save the IRS from sending you any further notices about this account. Now, if you think this applies to you and you've been getting a lot of those B notices, you've got a lot of notices, you know it's right, you've gone through the paces, that's where you want to look in the instructions. It gives you some information about what to do about that. So let's go into some of these details now about these different forms. So box 1 reports rents from real estate over $600 in box 1 of the 1090 miscellaneous. So that could be real estate rentals for office space, but don't report if you're paying a real estate agent or property manager, because they're supposed to report that rent paid to the property owner instead. So if you're paying rent to real estate agent or property manager, you don't have to worry about this. They're going to report that to the property owner. Or if you're doing machine rentals. Rentals are basically what goes in box 1. If the rental is part of a contract that includes both a machine and an operator, you're supposed to separate those amounts. So prorate the amounts between the equipment that you're actually renting in box 1 and the operator in box 7. So think of maybe if you had somebody come out and do some dirt work and you're renting both the machine and the guy to do the dirt work. Those are 2 different types of things. So separate out what is the equipment rental versus the laborer is the way to think of that. Also think about pasture or land rent. Let's say you have a farmer paying for use of grazing land. That is going to be box 1. There's some of the more unusual types of rents that I'm just going to throw out there. You may not see these all that often, but coin-operated amusements, if leased, like a video or pinball game or jukeboxes, pool table, slot machines, gaming devices, those are all considered all within box 1. So there's a little bit more meat to box 1 than maybe some may realize. So rents is the name of the box, but a lot of those different types of rents, pasture, machinery, coin-operated amusements, as well as our traditional thought processes is real estate rentals. So that's all box 1. Box 2 is for royalties. So royalties, let's say from publishing to an author, or an intangible like a copyright or patent or trade name or trademark, any royalties derived from that. Or oil and gas or mineral properties of $10 or more. So everything else that we just talked about has like that $600 rule. This is one of those exceptions. So oil and gas or mineral properties gets reported in box 2 if it's over $10. They don't have to wait until they reach the $600 rule. However, if it's a surface royalty, this is one of the other exceptions, so it's always good to check out. The bottom line for most of these is know why you're paying something. So if it's a surface royalty, it goes up here into box 1 instead. If you have an oil and gas payment for a working interest, that goes in box 7 instead. And last of all, any timber royalties made under a pay-as-you-cut contract, those are not even supposed to show up in here at all. So yeah, they're a timber royalty, so we may want to default to calling it a box 2 royalty. Because it's a specifically covered rule, timber royalties made under that pay-as-you-cut contract go instead on a 1099-S, proceeds from real estate transactions. So that may not be like something you think of right away. I know that doesn't follow the normal pattern, but I just wanted to kind of point out what some of the exceptions are to that. Box 3, other income. Here is a variety of other items of income. Most commonly, this is prizes and awards. So it can include, let's say, the fair market value of merchandise won on a game show. So all these folks that win prizes on the game show, the fair market value of that merchandise is going to show up, or should show up, in box 3 on a 1099 miscellaneous. It could be that it's a sweepstakes winnings. Now, as long as there's no wager involved. Now, if there's a wager involved where they had to wager something for that winning, it would be a form W2G instead for gambling earnings or income. It can also be payment received, this box 3, payment received by the beneficiary of a deceased employee. Here it changes that that employee passes away, it's supposed to be put on box 3 of a 1099 miscellaneous. Taxable damages are supposed to show in box 3 unless it's for back pay. That ends up going the whole W2 route. But taxable damages, Indian gaming profits are a box 3. Medical research study payments, so somebody who volunteers for those medical research studies, any payments derived from that go into box 3 here. Termination payments for a self-employed insurance salesperson. So there's some pretty specific things that I'll get thrown into box 3 here. If you're ever interested in my manual, I have links to all the different instructions, to not only the forms but the general instructions. So some of them are kind of interesting where these like obscure things go. But termination payments to self-employed insurance salespeople. Punitive damages also, and that includes some compensatory damages. Foreign agricultural workers that are on an H-2A visa, that is also specifically covered under box 3, and any accounts reported under the Fatca. So there's a lot that actually gets stuffed into here of the other income. Box 4, now it's kind of funny for some reason, even if you don't have all of them numbered consecutive like this, for some reason number 4 throughout all the different 1099s ends up being our federal income tax withheld. So if you had to do backup withholding, for example, where you have to take the 24% out of a 1099, whenever you take taxes out for any reason, even if it's the tiniest dollar amount, it goes here, box 4. It's it is federal income tax withheld. So that is going to be a recurring theme. The box 4 always seems to be the box number for those. Box 5, if you see on our form, says fishing boat proceeds. Fishing boat related income has no minimum threshold, so it doesn't matter if it is $1. All of it has to be reported. And it's generally fishing proceeds where the organization considers a worker to be self-employed. So it could be a share of the proceeds from the sale of a catch or the fair market value of a distribution in kind to crew members if it's normally less than 10 crew. So if you have occasion where you're having to report income from any sort of fishing activity, you definitely want to go to these instructions and kind of read more in depth into what this is. But if you have a cash payment of up to $100 per trip, if it's contingent on a minimum catch and there's additional duties, if it's traditional, so there's a lot of little nuances to this. But again, don't report any amounts here that are wages reportable on a W-2. So you don't want to do double reporting, and you don't ever want an occasion where you're reporting a W-2 and a 1099 to the same individual. So you want to look in maybe more in depth if you think that there's fishing boat proceeds or fishing activity that you need to report as to how to do that properly. Box 6 says medical and healthcare payments. This is over $600. It doesn't matter if it's a corporation or not, but they at least allow the $600 threshold. It could be a physician or supplier or provider of some sort of healthcare services. But it would also include insurance payments. And this is where, again, corporations are not exempt unless they're a tax-exempt hospital or a facility owned by the U.S. or state. That's one occasion where they are exempt. But it may include drugs or injections or dentures or any other similar item if it's included in their payment. So instead of separating those out, like before I told you, if you have rents and, let's say, labor, you're separating out one 1099 for rent and one for box 7 labor. Here it kind of doesn't matter. If it's part of the payment, they don't want you to separate it, you would just report the whole amount. But if it's a payment to a pharmacy for prescription drugs, that's one that specifically you're not to include in the medical and healthcare payments box. So anything over $600, for the most part, you don't have to worry about separating. If some of it includes, other than just the labor portion of it, you put it all together unless it's payment to a pharmacy for prescription drugs. That's the only drugs that are not part of it. Drugs to, let's say, a physician or some other payment is okay to be included. As we look further, the most common one, kind of the heavy hitter, the one that everybody thinks about when they think of a 1099 is all box 7. And you'll see now on a lot of the information, it's referred to as NEC, non-employee compensation. So if you see little things or notations talking about NEC, that's all they're talking about, literally non-employee compensation, the name of box 7. It's the most commonly used box in the 1099 Miscellaneous, and where a wide variety of all kinds of payments appear. So non-employee commissions, accountant or attorney fees. So none of us escape that, right, in our profession. Other professionals, non-employee bonuses, director fees, because that's actually statutorily by law supposed to be reported there. Any non-employee mileage. Now you have to be careful here because all these things I'm mentioning, sometimes the tendency is for an employee to be tempted to put it on here. If they're an employee, it should not be on the 1099. But if they're not an employee, that mileage or expense amounts, fish purchases for cash, so that's one of those different sort of ones, oil and gas payments for working interest, expenses for the use of an entertainment facility you treat as compensation, so it's the expenses incurred for the entertainment facility, along with almost any kind of payment that doesn't fit a category for another box on the 1099. So it kind of seems, I guess counterintuitive, because other income you think, well, that's the stuff all box. Almost more commonly, it's the box 7 if it doesn't fit in another defined area. If there are any amounts reported there in box 7, it changes the due date. So anything, if it happens to be in this box 7, the 1099 itself and the 1096, which is kind of our cover or summary page, has to be furnished to the IRS by January 31st. Everything in all the other boxes, you have to February 28th, or even a month later, you have to March if you do it electronic. And there is a more comprehensive list of all the different due dates, but if it is box 7, you don't get extra time. January 31st is the due date to the IRS, whether electronic, whether by paper. And in the case of when you're furnishing this to the recipient, it's always January 31st, but the IRS would give you longer if you had other boxes instead. Box 8 is a substitute payments in lieu of dividends or interest. So it's a long description. It's basically payments of at least $10 received by a broker for a customer in lieu of dividends or tax-exempt interest as a result of a loan on customer securities. So you can see if you're not in that kind of business, most of these boxes really aren't going to apply to you. But if you are in preparation, it's good to know what should exist in these boxes, because then we can do kind of the logic or the fact test. Because having this knowledge and being armed with it, we can say, oh, I see this is reported here. Do you have, in this case, it's $10, more than $10 received by your broker in lieu of dividends because of a result of a loan on your securities. And if they're like, no, that's not, then it kind of gives us the ability to do a fact check. Box 9 is used when the payer makes a direct sale of $5,000 or more for resale. Now, this is just a checkbox. It has no dollar amount, and it can be used in conjunction with amounts reported elsewhere. So let's say in conjunction with box 7, but because it was a direct sale of $5,000 or more for resale, then there would be a checkbox in addition to that. Box 10 is for reporting crop insurance proceeds of $600 or more paid to farmers by insurance companies. So box 10 is crop insurance proceeds, unless, and of course the exceptions, unless the farmer notifies the insurance company that their expenses were capitalized under Section 278, 263A, or 447. So if the informer says, wait, I've capitalized these, and tells the insurance company, then they would not report it there. Box 13 is reporting excess golden parachute payments. And 14, now this is commonly misunderstood, box 14, gross proceeds paid to an attorney of $600 or more. Generally, this is not for the attorney's services. That would normally be in box 7, but rather settlement agreements. So even if the attorney fees are paid out of that settlement, then this is in a case, let's say there was an award and they pay it to the attorney and the attorney takes their portion out of it and then pays it on to the client. That would be an appropriate use of the gross proceeds paid to an attorney in box 14. Unfortunately, this box is often used incorrectly to report just the attorney fees paid in the course of a trade or business. That would be box 7 instead. Attorney and accountant fees are box 7. So that's commonly misunderstood because people just read the title and think, oh, well, that's where I put my attorney fees. No, it's actually box 7 and it carries the earlier due dates. This is if you have think more like a settlement would be commonly where box 14 would be used instead. Box 15A is for Section 409A deferrals, which is funny. They have it and it's been existing for quite a few years. However, it says in the instructions you don't have to complete this box. And for details, see notice 2008 115. Well, this has been that we don't have to complete it since 2008. They still have it on there as an option, but it's funny that they have not removed it ever since. 15B is reporting Section 409A income, and it's funny that the amounts included in box 15B are also supposed to be included in box 7. So if you have any of these obscure things, the 409A income or deferrals, you want to look more into the instructions for some help in how to report those. And then boxes 16 through 18 is reporting state information when necessary. So if you have a state, or let's say especially if you've had state tax withheld for any reason, you definitely want that to be on there, because like box 4, basically box 16, if you have any state taxes paid in or withheld for one of these 1099s, if it's not reported to them, they have no way of knowing, and they won't be able to credit that person's account for the taxes paid in. So it's very important that box 4 and respectively 16 for any state withholding is reported on there. So there's a lot to this form. It's our most common one. It is, I know there's a lot of meat to that. So we're going to do just a real quick recap within the next 2 slides. So the generic titles, as you look through all these different boxes, and we know even as seemingly innocent as it is the rents, there's a lot more meat to that. Royalties, prizes and awards, or other. There's a lot of that other. Backup or other withholding, fishing boat income, medical and healthcare. And the most common, that box 7, is non-employee compensation. You'll see referred to as NEC quite often. And all these myriad of other types of things. So we have a lot that we covered on the 1090 miscellaneous, and that's a lot to absorb, I know. So feel free to come back to these slides and refer back to them. But for the most part, that box 7 is kind of where most of us live within the 1099 miscellaneous world. But now you know there's a lot of other things that go on that form.